Hello, everybody. Today we're going to read some Kant. I'm going to share my screen. So, last time, and you can check on my YouTube for the other video, it'll be very close to this one because I read Kant earlier on today, and it's the 3rd of April 2024. And what's going to be amazing is in a few years I'm going to look back in this video and it will be here forever. Okay, Prolegomena, Kant and Hume on mathematics as synthetic a priori propositions. The first part of the main transcendental question is concerned with how pure mathematics is possible. An examination of mathematics, the propositions of which are synthetic, will reveal its a priori ground of knowledge. Mathematics is a science. It can only be possible as a science if its synthetic propositions can be known a priori. Kant claims that because Hume only utilized the synthetic a posteriori analytic a priori distinction, he failed to notice that mathematics consisted of synthetic a priori propositions. To show the synthetic a priori nature of mathematical judgment, we will use Kant's own example, 7 plus 5 equals 12. The analytic proposition a priori would be 7 plus 5 equals the sum of 7 and 5. In this case, the subject term is contained in or thought in the predicate term, and it would be contradictory to deny this proposition. However, 7 plus 5 equals 12 is synthetic because the sum 12 is only equal to 7 added to 5 when one adds something to the equation, 7 plus 5. And what is added is counting. Calling in the aid of the fingers of my hand as intuition, I now add 1 by 1 to the number 7, the units which I previously took together to form the number 5, and with the aid of that figure, see the number 12 come into being. I cannot by simply analyzing the terms 7 and 5 come up with the term 12, as I can with 7 plus 5 equals the sum of 7 and 5. According to Kant, Hume rejected the synthetic nature of mathematics because he rejected its a priori nature, as he presupposed the exclusive disjunction of either analytic a priori or synthetic a posteriori. As mathematics was not known a posteriori, it was known a priori, and thus its propositions are analytic. Had he seen that mathematics consisted of synthetic a priori propositions, he could have, Kant claims, extended that category to include metaphysical propositions, and he could have saved them from their fate. If we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? Analytic a priori reasoning? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? Synthetic a posteriori propositions? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. Several authors have explored the suggestion that Hume supposed mathematics to consist of synthetic a posteriori propositions. However, they all generally recognize that the criterion of certainty for Kant is logical necessity, while the hallmark of Hume's analysis is psychological necessity. Atkinson argues, quote, whilst Hume indubitably held mathematical propositions to be a priori and necessary, his apparent conception of a necessary proposition was wider than the current, or indeed Kant's conception of an analytic one. That whilst he did not explicitly pose the question, analytic or synthetic, the terms are after all not his, he came closer in the treatise to regarding mathematical propositions as synthetic, necessary than analytic truths. Beck, in this volume, argues that Kant, quote, thinks Hume was in error in failing to see that the difference between a priori in the sense of going beyond possible experience and a priori in the sense of underlying possible experience. Beck's claim leads us into an ongoing exegetical problem, one that is an important issue in Kant scholarship. It concerns the definitions of technical terms and is the focus of Daniel Anderson's paper, quote, a note on the synthesity of mathematical propositions in Kant's Prolegomena. Included in this volume, how one uses technical terms such as analytic and synthetic is bound to bias one's outlook. Anderson is concerned with Ayer's attack in Language, Truth and Logic against Kant's means of distinguishing between analytic and synthetic judgments. Kant thinks he is adopting a logical distinction in mathematical propositions, whereas Ayer argues that in fact he is adopting a psychological one, holding that 7 plus 5 equals 12 as a synthetic proposition is based on the psychological criterion, not the logical one. Ayer's position seems to be, given his definition of synthicity, a return to the pre-Kantian view held by Hume. If a given proposition is synthetic, it can only be known a posteriori. For Ayer, this is analytically true, as what it is for a proposition to be synthetic is for that proposition to be known through experience. Ayer also presents his own definition of analyticity. Quote, that a proposition's validity should follow simply from the definitions of the terms contained in it. To which Anderson replies that this is Ayer's own definition and not Kant's. Other scholars who have suggested that mathematics for Hume consists of synthetic truths, known a priori, urge caution with respect to drawing any similarities between these truths and Kant's synthetic a priori propositions. Coleman, for example, urges that Hume can only be rendered consistent if one adopts the proposition he held that mathematical propositions were synthetic a priori. However, she notes, quote, the sense in which I am using synthetic a priori should not be confused with its Kantian meaning. The sense in which he would maintain that there are synthetic a priori judgments must be understood only as indicating a necessary relation between empirical concepts which cannot be determined by the formal relation between these concepts or by an analysis of these concepts. Newman also makes similar points. Geometrical propositions are necessary truths, but not analytic. Hume makes no attempt to secure its necessary status with the Kantian formula, although he maintains that where the propositions of geometry are concerned, quote, the person who assents not only conceives the ideas according to the propositions, but is necessarily determined to conceive them in that particular manner. The only factor he makes appeal to as determining is the character of sensible space, the invariant nature of which seems to rest in the treatise upon the constant character of physical space. Kant on Hume's dialogue concerning natural religion. Arguments concerning natural theology are raised in the conclusion to the Prolegomena by Jerry Gill's paper, quote, Kant, Analogy and Natural Theology, included in this volume, is one of the few scholarly treatments focusing directly on this section of the text. It provides a clear overview of the arguments in sections 57 to 59. Gill focuses on Kant's use of the image of boundaries and limits and is led to claim that, quote, the results of one's approach to natural theology are going to be different depending on the sort of root metaphor one begins with. Kant's overall commitment to a visual metaphor leads him to an interpretation of the bounds of reason, whose inherent passivity and staticity renders the cognitive gulf between the human and the divine essentially unbridgeable. This section of the introduction will focus on Kant's answer to Hume's perceived skepticism with respect to the nature of the deity, as he finds it in Hume's dialogue concerning natural religion. As with causality, Kant wants to provide an objective ground or validation that avoids all skepticism that results when reason extends the limitations of possible experience in themselves. Okay, so this is just going to have a little interest here because I'm mainly concerned. We'll have a read and see how this goes, but I'm mainly concerned in causation. Okay. As with causality, Kant wants to provide an objective ground of validation that would avoid the skepticism that results when reason extends the limitations of items of possible experience to avoid things themselves. The German edition of the dialogue was available in 1781, 2 years after the initial publication of the dialogues in English. Kant's acquaintance with the text and appreciation of its arguments is evident not only in the Prolegomena, as we shall soon see. In his lectures on philosophical theology, he makes detailed reference to the and presents criticism of Hume's objections to what Kant calls the physio-teleological proof, which makes use of experience of the present world in general and infers from this to the existence of an author of the world and to the attributes which would belong to its author as such. Before introducing Hume's arguments into discussion, I will look at some passages in 57, quote, on the determination of the bounds of pure reason, end quote, to show the context within which Kant refers to Hume's dialogues. Kant begins this section of the Prolegomena by opposing two absurdities, or contradictions. The first concerns the limits of possible experience and makes two claims. It would be contradictory to think that we can know anything more about an object than belongs to the possible experience of it. That is, we can only have experience of objects through the forms of intuition of space and time. We can only know them as phenomena as they appear to us as objects of sensory experience, and we cannot know them. We can know them. We cannot know more of them than is possible through such experience. Okay. Nor can we have knowledge of any object that is intuited outside of space and time, or how can be, or whether or not it is determined by its own nature, in the way that intuited objects are determined by the a priori principles. This sets the limits of our knowledge, but something lies beyond the boundary of the limits of our knowledge, as determined objects are incomplete. Quote, bounds always presuppose a space existing outside a certain definite place and enclosing it. Limits do not require this, but are mere negations, which affect a quantity insofar as it is not have absolutely complete. The second contradiction concerns what lies beyond the boundaries which enclose possible experience. It would be absurd first to claim that there are no such things themselves beyond the boundary. The sensuous world is nothing but a chain of appearances connected according to universal laws. It has therefore no subsistence by itself. It is not the thing in itself, and consequently must point to that which contains the basis of this appearance, to beings which cannot be cognized merely as a phenomenon, but as things in themselves. It would also be absurd to regard our way of knowing things as being the only way of knowing. The objects of possible experience must be intuited in space and time. As conditioned, they are limited to being experienced in these ways. It would be presumptuous of us to declare that the means by which empirical objects are known, intuited in space and time, conditioned by the principles of possible experience, is the only way things in themselves can be known. So the things in themselves are similarly conditioned. This is, of course, a contradiction, because the things in themselves would no longer be things in themselves, but would be objects of possible experience. This reason and the principle of possible experience are a priori concepts, the faculty of and means by which the objects of experience are conditioned or determined must be and are only valid in their application to experience. Quote, a concept of this nature does nothing but determine for an intuition the general way in which it can be used for judgments. So absurdity results if we regard the limits of our principles and our experience and our reason to be the limits of things in themselves as well, that is, valid and applicable outside their empirical use. It also occurs if we regard things in themselves as objects of reason, the role of reason being to apply the synthesis of representation to its objects. Only phenomenon objects, as they appear to us, are subject to union by reason and governed by the a priori principles. Okay. So what I'm going to do is, I'm just going to skip over this because, it's not really primarily what I'm interested in. So we'll go straight into Kant's Prolegomena. Immanuel Kant, Prolegomena to any future metaphysics. I might actually start a new one for this. Okay, I'll see you next time.